and 30th gathering of the Lexington Veterans Association. I'm Linda Dixon. We're very happy to welcome you. To start our meeting, would we all please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and our good friend Bill Stern will lead us.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Once again, we have some delicious refreshments. Thank you to our volunteers for the lovely baked goods. Thank you to Starbucks of Lexington Center, who continues to supply us with delicious coffee. Thank you to those who give us cash donations to offset our operating expenses. If you're new to the group, or if you haven't been getting our emails or would like to get emails of our exciting programs, we have a sign-up sheet on the table against the wall. Just give us your name and email address. We'll put you in our database. We have a couple of people who wish to give some announcements. And first, I would like to introduce Ryan Daly from the Department of Veterans Affairs at the VA in Bedford. Ryan?
Hi everyone. So I'm Ryan. I work in the neuropsychology department at the VA here in Bedford, and we are currently putting on a 12-week aging and memory education course that's going on, and we're putting it on over the next couple of months to reach out to veterans in the area and teach about some of the differences between memory decline that comes with normal aging and memory decline that comes with things like Alzheimer's disease or any other type of dementing illnesses. We're also hoping to provide anyone that's interested with some different methods to help maintain kind of where they're at in terms of their memory and their cognition. This is a research study because this is a service that we provide at the VA currently, and we're trying to see kind of where we can bolster up some of the course and see what we're doing well. So I have a sign-up sheet here that I'm going to pass around, and all that this sheet is, it has a space for your name, your phone number, your email, and all that this would be your approval for me to give you a call to hear more about the study. So this isn't you signing up for the study or anything like that. If you have any questions for me, I will be here after the talk to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
When does it start?
It starts on June 2nd, and it's once a week for 12 weeks. I should have specified that. So.
Question. Will there have any connection to the million veteran survey that's been making?
Did you ask if I have any connection? It does not. It does not. And you do not have to qualify for veteran care to participate. You just simply have to have served at some point in time. So.
Thank you. Sounds like a very worthwhile study. Pat Costello has an announcement. Is it on behalf of the Council of Aging? Pat? Anyway, she will tell us.
Hi, by now you've gotten your property tax bills, and I just, if any of you are considering reverse mortgages, I'd like to just take a minute and tell you about our tax deferral program here in Lexington. It's not Clause 41A is a state program, but it's not accepted by all the municipalities, but we do have it here in Lexington. If you're over 65 and your income is under $65,000, you can defer your property taxes until such time as your property is transferred, which means if you pass away or if you sell your house and move on somewhere else. In Lexington, it's considered the same as the one-year loan. And currently, the interest rate would be 0.25%, which is really fabulous. It varies from community to community. I know Sudbury is about 2%, Westboro is 0%, and I think Arlington is at 3%. But at any rate, you can look it up on the website for the town's website in the assessor's office. Or you can stop by, you can pick up a brochure that tells you about all of the exemptions and deferrals that are available to you, either as a senior or as a veteran, because there are some others in there that are for veterans only. But thank you very much. Yes?
Is that 65,000 joint or?
Joint.
Joint.
Yeah. 60, and that, by the way, also varies from town to town, because originally the way it's written in the state law, it's 70 years old. And the interest rate is 8%. So it's capped at 8%. But in Lexington, this current year, it is 0.25%. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And now let me introduce our speaker. Today we welcome back Dr. BobAllison, who has spoken before this group a couple of times in the past, I do believe. Dr. Allison has taught American history at Suffolk University in Boston since 1992, when he earned his doctorate in the history of American civilization at Harvard. He has served as chair of Suffolk's history department for the past 10 years. He's the author of 7 books, and he's won numerous teaching awards. He currently hosts a free online course on the USS Constitution. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the USS Constitution Museum, a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and a vice president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. Today, Dr. Allison will talk about the years leading up to the Battle of Lexington. To paraphrase John Adams, the revolution did not start with the Revolutionary War. It started in the minds of the people over the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. Please welcome BobAllison.
Now, as I said, a British fleet in a port tended to lose men because if you were in the British Navy in the 1740s, it was a terrible place to be. It wasn't, actually Samuel Johnson, the great British man of letters, said that the only men who go to sea are those who cannot contrive to get themselves into prison. Being at sea is like being in prison with the added possibility of drowning. And being, at least on a merchant vessel, you would be paid. If you were a sailor in the British Navy in this period, you were going to be paid very little. You were in until they were done with you, which tended to be when you died. And you would be, iron discipline ruled the British Navy. Okay, so the sailors on their ships conspiring to get off, even at the cost of death. The officers, when their vessels were in port, tended to rent rooms or stay with friends in town, the much more comfortable lodgings they could get in town. So the fleet is in Boston Harbor. The men are trying to get off. The officers are renting rooms around town. And Boston is a small town. People knew where people were. So this mob that appears before the Province House have with them 7 British officers. They have gotten out of their beds and now are holding hostage. And they appear before the governor outside the Province House saying, "We will give you back these officers when you release the men who were imprisoned on the British fleet." Big problem. What do you do now if you're Governor Shirley? Well, the first thing Governor Shirley does is he marches up to these officers who had gotten themselves kidnapped, grabs them, drags them onto his side of the line. He can't believe these guys were so stupid as to get taken prisoner by the mob. But that doesn't appease the mob. They don't say, oh, gee, you took our hostages. No, there are a lot more of them than there are of the governor. So the governor says, well, I will have to consult with the council. That is the body of advisors chosen by the Massachusetts Assembly to advise the governor. And they will meet in the townhouse, now the old State House, in the council chamber. So the governor says, I will have to meet with the council to decide what to do about this matter. You know, he knows that these people need to be appeased. He also knows that Commodore Knowles was within his powers to round up able-bodied sailors. The governor says, well, the council will consider this. So he calls the council together. They are in the council chamber of the old State House, which has actually just been restored to look the way it did in this period. And Commodore Knowles is also there, and Commodore Knowles has a solution to this problem. People don't like the British fleet taking able-bodied sailors. Well, he can start shelling the town at any time to teach these people a lesson, which he thinks they should be taught. Governor Shirley doesn't think that's going to be the best way to approach the problem. Now, he did have the foresight when he told everyone the council will be meeting to post the militia on the stairs of the old State House. The council chamber is on the second floor, only accessible by two narrow sets of stairs. Governor Shirley knows this, the mob knows this, and as the council is meeting, they hear the windows smashing downstairs as the mob is coming in, and they want to come upstairs to tell again the governor what they think about what's happened. So Governor Shirley is in a difficult position here. Well, fortunately the militia keeps the mob away, and over the course of about a week we have a standoff between the governor, Commodore Knowles, who keeps saying, I'm ready to start shelling at any time, and he can't believe the governor is pussyfooting around with this mob when, I don't know, is anyone here former Commodore? You know, what you would have done in a case like this to teach these recalcitrant people a lesson. Anyway, Governor Shirley knows, yeah, Knowles has the power to do this, but he's going to sail away. I'm going to be left either with a burned out town that Knowles has just demolished, or a burned out town that the mob has burned because they're really angry. He has to negotiate this. He gets Knowles to release a number of the impressed sailors. Knowles is really angry about that because now he can't sail directly back to England. He actually has to sail to New York to impress sailors there. And oddly enough, there's no problem at all impressing sailors in New York. But this is the last time a British officer will try to impress sailors in Boston because it's just too much trouble. And so Shirley is really stuck between Knowles and the mob. And now when Knowles leaves, he realizes there's another looming problem because the British government isn't going to be happy when they hear about this. So he sends a series of very interesting letters to the Lords of Trade in London explaining what had happened, putting this in the best possible way. And Shirley's big suggestion is that something really needs to be done here to rein in what he calls the democratical nature of the Constitution. This idea that people here don't have to be dragged into British service. And the point that any 10 people, even 10 men, even of the meanest sort, can sign a warrant for a town meeting. And then whoever shows up is the official voice of the town. What they do is the law of the town. And Shirley sees this as a very dangerous thing because you have all of this power in the hands of any 10 people or the citizens of Boston. And I don't know, citizens of Lexington may be a bit more high-toned than those of Boston. But Shirley sees this as a problem, and he advises that something should be done about it. If not, we're headed for big trouble. Bigger trouble than the fact that Knowles couldn't impress sailors. Okay, this is November of 1747. We have this riot over impressment, revealing the nature of this political constitution here, where Any 10 people can sign a warrant for a town meeting. And whatever the meeting decides, if you want to have a voice, you better get to the meeting and be part of it. It's really different from any other place in the British Empire or any other place in the Western world. As people in Massachusetts, in each of the towns, have more power over their own affairs than anyone else in the British Empire. They don't have town meetings in England. They don't have, you don't sign a warrant and go decide what the town will do. This is something Commodore Knowles couldn't understand. Governor Shirley understood it because he had been here for about 20 years at this point. He had come, he was a lawyer, and actually he left Massachusetts to become the governor of the Bahamas. And he was there for about 10 years, then he retired to Roxbury. After the siege of Louisburg, he was offered a knighthood, and he declined a knighthood, said he'd prefer to have the cash value. Which shows us he had been in Massachusetts a long time. And he used that to build a mansion in Roxbury, which still stands, the Shirley Eustace House. This is one of these episodes that indicates where things are going. Now the other happens in 1750. You remember, you make the Puritans, really vehement Protestants, had settled Massachusetts back in the 1630s, getting away from the Church of England, which they thought was too much like the Church of Rome. And they came here, became Congregationalists, and then late in the 17th, early in the 18th century, it had become, first, the Church of England is allowed to set up a little church in Boston. And it became more politically and socially acceptable to be an Anglican. You know, sometimes when I'm talking to a group, I ask who's a Congregationalist, who's an Anglican. I'm not going to impose on you like that. Linda's going to take a survey afterward. Let me know. Be careful, the room is filled with Anglicans. Anyway, a minister at the West Church in Boston, Jonathan Mayhew, heard that the Anglican Church in Boston, and there are now at this point 2 or 3 Anglican churches, were going to observe the 31st of January as, anyone here an Anglican, you can tell us what January 31st is, but maybe not here. You know, the Anglican Church had made a saint of King Charles I. He had all of the criteria you needed to be a saint in the Anglican Church. He had been martyred by, well, actually a bloody story about the English Civil War, and don't want to distract from the main event, which is the American Revolution, by talking about that series of episodes. But Charles I, he was the reason the Puritans had left England. Then the Puritans who stayed in England wound up overthrowing Charles I and beheading him. And then the Anglican Church, after the restoration of the monarchy in the person of Charles I's son, Charles II, had sainted him. And now January 31st, which was the anniversary of his martyrdom, if you're an Anglican, or his just deserts, if you're a Congregationalist, was his Saint's Day. And Jonathan Mayhew heard that the Anglicans in Boston were going to observe the Saint's Day of Saint Charles I. So he spent the month of January giving a series of sermons about why this was a bad idea, why Charles I was not a saint, should not be venerated, why we should not have a saint's day for him. For a variety of reasons I don't need to get into here. He said Charles I, was a bad man and shouldn't have, I don't know, is anyone here a partisan of Charles I? Or, his descendants are still on the throne, so, anyway. The big thing that Mayhew stresses here isn't just, boy, what a bad guy Charles I was, he's the reason we left, but we can decide who is a fit ruler. We can decide if a governor really deserves respect. Because Charles I didn't just govern through divine right. He had to be accepted by those he governed. Fundamental idea about government here, which Mayhew, a minister, is espousing in his pulpit and publishes his sermons. It's not just because people want to read 100 years after his death about what a bad guy Charles I was, but because we have the power to evaluate those who govern us. Fundamental idea, which is kind of quirky if you're in England, but not at all here, because this is what people do. People here do judge their governors. Our town meetings meet every year and choose all of our officials, sheriffs, tax collectors. You're reading the thing about the tax bills. Tax collectors have to be elected. And magistrates, everyone is elected by the town meeting for 1 year. And if you don't do what the town meeting wants, you're out. This is the way the system works here. This is why Governor Shirley thought trouble was brewing, because these town meetings had a great deal of power. Now, for much of the history between, well, actually since the 1690s, there hadn't been any real conflict between the British Empire and what was happening in the towns of Massachusetts. In fact, no one in England had to think about the towns of Massachusetts. This is a strange thing for us to comprehend, because we all think that whatever happens in our town is something of great note to everyone else in the world, that the world is watching Lexington, Boston, to see what we're going to do next. And for much of this period, there wasn't any reason for the British Empire or the town of Lexington or even the town of Boston to come into conflict. But then in the 1760s, we see a number of things beginning to change. The big thing that's happening here, by the way, I could cut all of this short and simply say, there was not a conspiracy by the British government to rein in the towns of Massachusetts. They weren't thinking at all about the towns of Massachusetts when the British government in the 1760s began enacting a series of policies and measures that were going to make the towns restless and rebellious. What they really were thinking about was an empire. Because after 1760-61, another war between the British and French empires, the British win this one quite handily. After this, the British government realizes we have an empire, which is something they hadn't really understood before. And the thinking had been in Europe that colonies are a drain on the mother country. We have to restrain people from going. The real focus should be on what's happening in the metropolis. And after about 1760-61, British thinkers begin to realize the empire is really the thing that is making us the strongest nation in Europe. It's not we're the strongest nation in Europe and we have all these colonies. We're the strongest nation in Europe because we have all of these colonies. And the real focus for Britain in terms of her colonies was not Massachusetts or Virginia or Pennsylvania. In fact, if we were in London in 1760, 61, or 1770, or even 1773 and 4, and we were talking about the empire or the colonies, Massachusetts would be very low on our list of colonies we were thinking about. Our real interest would be in the cash-producing colonies of Barbados and Jamaica and of India, which the East India Company was in the process of taking over from the various Rajas in India. So we have a growing empire in England and a recognition that the empire is what's making this such a successful enterprise, and then the thinking we should do something to govern the empire. Boston had been doing pretty well with trade. In fact, this was the mainstay of the economy here. It's probably not a shock to anyone here to be told that in the 1750s and 60s, Massachusetts did not have a very good climate. Didn't have a good long growing season. Didn't have good soil for farming. And so the Massachusetts economy has developed really through trade, through trading things from one place to another. And the fact that Massachusetts had access to a lot of good wood to build ships and barrels and other things. So this is a shipping place to ship stuff off. You know, you can raise cattle and sheep here to produce wool, beef, leather, and you can use some of that to feed the labor force in the West Indies. Also, you can catch codfish to feed the labor force of the West Indies. But the real benefit from Massachusetts is in its timber and in its sailors, and it becomes a commercial center. And so what the British government tries to do is regulate the trade that is making the British Empire prosperous, and is also making some merchants in places like Boston, Newport, and other vicinities prosper. So a series of tax laws to kind of regulate all of this trade. Well, the British government had imposed taxes before on trade, but it never sent over anyone to collect the taxes. Now they actually lower the stated tax rate from what it was, but they're going to send people over to enforce the law. This is the big change. Parliament is trying to govern the empire, governing the empire by imposing relatively minor taxes, and hoping that this then will make the British Empire even more prosperous. This is really the moment of Britain's triumph, had defeated the French, taken over North America, coming to control India. This is after about 3 centuries of colonial enterprise, an enterprise begun to get the wealth of the Indies, and by this time Britain is taking over India, is sending ships to China, bringing the goods from India and China into Europe. And at this very moment, when Britain's trying to make sense of this, a rebellion starts because of the very nature of this, because of the fact that the British Parliament is trying to rein things in. So you see a change happening here in Britain's governing of the empire, and what hasn't changed is this fundamental idea that people in Massachusetts have, that we govern ourselves. We don't need someone else telling us what to do, someone we did not choose. And we elect our tax collectors here. We elect our sheriff. And if you didn't like the fact the sheriff had you arrested, you're probably not going to vote for him at the next town meeting. So, didn't mean to single you out. But, yes, sir.
Is Massachusetts the only colony that had this strong local
Was Massachusetts the only colony that had this strong local control? The other New England colonies did as well. But other than that, it is unique. Even Pennsylvania, which tries, William Penn had wanted to have the best governed place on earth. And so Penn thought the best thing to do then is to have, who would be better to govern a place than William Penn? So he established a form of government in which the proprietor would have all of the real power. There would be an assembly that would advise the proprietor, but at the end of the day, he's very much like, I hate to pick on Cambridge. The folks in the butt. Is anyone from Cambridge, by the way? Okay. You want the people, you want the people to be able to govern themselves, but at the end of the day, you want to tell them what's right or wrong. I mean, okay.
I'm not finished.
Thank you. I'll keep trying. Penn was going to govern. Virginia, you had real power in Virginia, about 40% of the people were enslaved. So in Virginia, ideas about, we should have any 10 of the meanest sort of people call a town meeting, well, that's not going to happen. You do have the planters, the guys who really control the property and the enslaved population, calling the shots. So you have different degrees of local participation here, but New England is really unique in having this real local control and real local political sense. So it is different. This is why the revolution takes a different tack in other places, and really why the fighting begins here over things that might not seem as significant in other places. Now, the big thing that happens in 1773, of course, is the destruction of the tea. But that's not the thing that really precipitates the rebellion in Massachusetts. There already is a resistance underway, and it's underway because of the nature of this, the changing nature of this relationship, or I should say Parliament's attempt to change the nature of this relationship between the people of Massachusetts and the Empire. They're trying to rein in these towns, or bring all of these places under the control of the metropolis. And in fact, January of 1773 opens with the governor of Massachusetts. Anyone know who was the governor in 1773? Thomas Hutchinson, very good. And Thomas Hutchinson, in another lifetime, probably would have been a very good college professor. And a number of reasons for this. He was an historian. Okay. He's actually writing a 3-volume history of Massachusetts. And the one thing college professors really like to do is, anyone know? Talk, exactly. Yeah. It seems like we've been here for a day now. And we like to lecture, okay? We not just talk, we like to lecture. We know you're really smart when you write down everything we say. And then at the end of the semester, we know you're really, really smart if what you say on our test agrees with what we think. If for some reason you disagree with what we say, we repeat it, speaking more slowly and using short, smaller words so that you'll get it. This is why, just as an aside, if a college professor ever approaches you asking you for you to vote for him or her, run the other way, because these are not good skills in the political world. So Thomas Hutchinson, though, is a very, very good, and also, it doesn't matter if we're really good lecturers or not. We will do it. And Thomas Hutchinson, in January of 1773, opened the session of the Massachusetts Assembly. It was meeting in Cambridge because there was some kind of a fever epidemic in Boston. So they moved out to Cambridge, and he thought things had been relatively tranquil in Massachusetts since there was an unpleasantness in 1770. Things had calmed down. This would be a good time to explain to the Massachusetts Assembly what their relationship is with the government of England and what their power is in governing Massachusetts. So Governor Hutchinson gave a 2-day lecture on the nature of the British Empire and the role of the Massachusetts Assembly in the British Empire. And that role is quite limited. In fact, Parliament is the governing force of the empire. Massachusetts' assembly does not govern Massachusetts. The British Parliament governs Massachusetts. If you argue that Parliament does not govern Massachusetts, then what you are really proposing is independence for Massachusetts. And he goes through what would happen in that case, because it would be impossible for Massachusetts to remain independent and self-governing for long. It would quickly be subsumed by an empire less benevolent, less committed to the liberties of the Magna Carta than the British Parliament. They would enjoy the liberties of people in the Spanish or French or Dutch Empire if they broke away from the British Empire. So Professor Hutchinson concluded at the end of day 2 of his seminar in government, their only choices were to submit to the will of Parliament or declare independence. And he knew that the consequences of that. Well, he thought when his lecture was printed up and published and read in England, people there would say, good, someone finally explained to these rubes what exactly it is they can do. People in England weren't happy when they saw this. They said, wait a minute. None of these people who've been saying we don't like the tax policies, we don't want troops, have said we want to be independent. And now he's saying this is your only choice. Submit to the will of Parliament or declare independence. They hadn't made that now he's telling them this is the only thing you can decide. And for their part, the Massachusetts Assembly isn't happy with this either. I mean, they're worn out after listening to this guy for 2 days. And so they call on their agent in London to have the Privy Council recall him. Even members of the Assembly who tended to like Governor Hutchinson or support him couldn't go along with this. You know, now they have to go back and tell their constituents, you know, we do have to submit to the will of Parliament after all. Governor Hutchinson told us so. People in their towns are going to say, well, we didn't tell you that. We're the ones who elected you. So this sets off it ruins Hutchinson politically. Well, it's the beginning of his ruin politically. The fact that he gives this long lecture saying your choices are submission or independence. And what do you know? They call for his recall. Another thing that seems even more baffling is this. Back in 1771, Parliament realized the British soldiers who had shot unarmed civilians in the streets of Boston and then were acquitted by a jury we really dodged one on that. What would have happened had they been convicted? What's going to happen the next time a Crown official in one of these colonies gets in trouble for violating some local law? What we need to do is make sure the judges answer not to these local juries, but to the law of the empire. So Parliament and said, we will pay the judges in the American provinces. Make sure the judges are impartial, that is, not susceptible to the will of these local mobs. Well, in Massachusetts, the Assembly says, well, wait a minute. Our charter, granted back in 1692, says that the Assembly decides how much the judges will be paid. Judges can't accept money from someone else. And the Assembly says judges cannot accept a salary from anyone else because the charter says so. And every judge in Massachusetts agrees he will not accept a Crown salary. Every judge except one. And that judge is Peter Oliver, the Chief Justice of what now later becomes the Supreme Judicial Court. And he also is, by the way, Thomas Hutchinson's brother-in-law. He's the Chief Justice. And to his credit, Peter Oliver, he's an iron manufacturer. He has this business, and much of his work as a judge involves going around the state, holding up in a tavern, hearing cases that are really kind of trivial. You know, there are things that I don't even think Judge Judy would touch, the kind of cases that come up. That here he's taking time away from his business. The British Crown is offering him a couple £100 a year, which does not cover what he is losing by being a judge in the first place. So he says, if the Crown wants to give me a salary, I'll take it. Well, what do you do now if you're the Assembly? John Adams, who's a member of the Assembly, says, well, he's actually violating the charter. Therefore, we can impeach him. And the other members of the Assembly say, well, that's not going to work, because if, A, we've never impeached anyone before, and B, the way the process works, the Assembly would impeach him, then presumably the case would be tried by the council. His brother-in-law presides over the council. His brother is the secretary of the province, who also sits on the council, and Governor Hutchinson will say, the Assembly can't impeach judges, no, case closed. And Adams says it doesn't matter, we have to do it. So the Assembly does impeach Judge Oliver, and sure enough, when it gets to the council, Governor Hutchinson says, the Assembly can't impeach Crown officials, case closed. So that, you would think, would be the end of it, until Judge Oliver goes out to Worcester and tries to impanel a jury. And the jurors come in. Now, Hutchinson, Oliver thought, you know, Boston is trouble. That's why we had moved the Assembly out. You have these hot-headed mobs in Boston. You have people like Samuel Adams in Boston who are going to stir up trouble. People in Worcester, presumably, are more reasonable and less whipped up into this enthusiasm created by people like Mayhew, etc. So Judge Oliver goes out to impanel a jury in Worcester, and the jurors come in, they sit down, they look over at the judge, and they say, well, wait a minute, you've been impeached by our Assembly. we can't serve in a court you're presiding over until this matter has been resolved. And they get up and walk out. I don't know if any of you have tried that if you've been on a jury. But he can't impanel a jury in Worcester. Okay. This is, I think, what John Adams meant when he talked about the revolution happening in the minds of people, that it was their assembly that governed here, and not, as Governor Hutchinson said, the will of Parliament. You have this change happening in the minds of people about their relationship to their government and who would govern them. And about 80 years later, this is really what brings these men on that early morning in April of 1775 to Lexington Green to stand up against the most powerful military force in the world. This idea that they would govern themselves. Much later, I think it was in the 1830s, a man who had been at Concord was asked by a young historian what had made him go and fight. And the big guy asked, was it the Stamp Act? And this old veteran said, I didn't think the stamps ever were sold, which is true. Well, was it the Tea Act? He said, I never drank tea. Well, was it the Intolerable Acts? He said, I don't know what they are. He says, well, what was it then? This man said, we had always governed ourselves. They meant that we would no longer do that. So we had to prevent that. It was just a matter of who is going to govern here. Will it be the will of Parliament, or will it be the men and women in the towns of Massachusetts? And they made, as Thomas Jefferson later called it, an election between submission and the sword. And for that, we are always grateful. So thank you. Yes.
Was there activity before that impressment time? Had the British come years previously continually impressing our merchantmen? Or was this the first time it happened and people rose up?
That's a very good question. Was this the first time this was the first on such a big scale?
Right.
There were smaller episodes of impressment in the, and remember, it only is going to happen during wartime. And between about 1711 and the end of the 1730s, there's peace between the British and French Empire. So there's no reason to do this. It really is the fact that this is a big episode. Okay, so it's not as though, boy, this has been going on, we have to put a stop to it. It's big. And there's a thinking that, well, what gives them the right to do this? And one of the really striking things is the mob, if we can call it that, was mainly about half women. And they didn't want their husbands, brothers, boyfriends, sons taken into service. And remember, sailors in this time were, as you know, Dr. Johnson's quote suggests, I don't even think they would have been a rung on the economic ladder in most places. Here in Massachusetts, though, sailors could be. I mean, there's a blend. We have big families, someone will go to sea, and you can actually make money doing this. So you have, is the nature of this particular moment, I think.
That time.
Yeah. Yes.
Sir, the development of the town meeting concept and that, how did that come about insidiously? I mean, were the Puritans somehow enlightened to think?
No, I don't. That's a very good question. How did the town meeting come about? And this is really something that develops here. And it develops because you are creating this new society, and who is it going to answer to? And it initially begins, and town meetings would happen. This is why we call it a meeting house, where the church services were held. Because also the town meeting would happen there. It's something that begins to split in the 18th century. But it really is a way of governing the town. And you don't have the kind of hierarchical administration you do in Britain. You have to have some way of deciding what is going to happen, and because you are creating this anew, it really happens really from the ground up. Okay, we have to appoint, what are the officials you really need? And that's why you have inspectors of fences and other things. And, think about it, the town meeting, it really is a democratic system created in a period when Governor Winthrop explains this in his sermon about the city upon a hill, that we are all going to be bound together in this work as one man, even though there are lots of social differences between us. So I know I'm giving a long-winded, rambling discourse that doesn't really answer your question. It begins in the 17th century as a reaction to direct circumstances. Virginia has a governing structure created by the government of the London Company initially. So they will send over a governor. In Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Company, the charter comes here. Governor Winthrop opens the first session of the General Court of Shareholders in 1630 and opens it up to all of the freeholders, or freemen, thank you, all the freemen. Okay. So you have this opening up, and also because you have 1,200 people who have arrived in Boston in the summer of 1630, you can't have all of them in Boston. They spread out to Watertown, Dorchester, Charlestown. So you have these different towns set up. You can't have someone in Boston saying, well, this is what we think should happen in Watertown. People in Watertown are better able to do that. It really comes out of the nature of the immediate circumstances, as well as the fact that each town really centers on a church. And the churches also are governed by their members, the ones who built it. So it's a fascinating story, a complicated story, and I fear I will simply get us all confused as well as annoyed if I try to answer it any further, but it is a local institution that begins here, not anywhere else. Yes, sir.
I want to thank you because you've given me a better understanding of what Abraham Lincoln said 87 years later. Of the people, for the people, by the people.
Exactly.
You feel it.
Yes, you can. Exactly. And Lincoln understood this, okay, implicitly. And
Can you repeat the question?
okay, he said it gives him a better understanding. I won't repeat the part where it says what a great lecture this was. No, he said it gives him a much better understanding of what Abraham Lincoln said 87 years later about government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which incidentally is a phrase he takes from, kind of paraphrases, a Massachusetts politician who said something similar in 1830, Daniel Webster, in his reply to Hayne. That is, he said, it is the people's government, created by the people, for the people, of the people. And that's really the essential thing. And it is an essential question. Yes, sir.
Would these poor guys who were impressed, would they be in British Navy for the rest of their lives?
Yeah, the poor guys who would be impressed, would they be in the British Navy for the rest of their lives? Yes. And, the British, yes, sir.
On this question of where does the balance of power lie, aren't we going through something like that even today? And we're hanging on every word that's going on between Secretary Kerry and the Iranians and Obama. And we think about that. But doesn't the power ultimately lie with the Congress, which is the true representative of the people?
Okay, good question. About, and it is, just to paraphrase it, we always see this kind of struggle about where ultimately power lies. And the question involves contemporary foreign policy and who really directs it, and Congress or the president, and they're always going to be at war. In fact, this is something John Adams understood in the Massachusetts Constitution. This is why the Massachusetts Constitution which is the oldest functioning written constitution in the world, and was adopted in 1780, 1781. And the last article of the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights says the executive shall never exercise legislative or judicial powers. The Legislature shall never exercise executive nor judicial powers. The judiciary shall never exercise executive nor legislative powers. That it mandates a separation of powers in the last clause, to the end that this will be a government of laws and not of men. And of course, the legislature is the lawmaking body. It makes the laws. The governor doesn't, the executive doesn't, it is the legislative branch. And this is, as you probably are aware, in the 18th century, that phrase, a government of laws and not of men, was the definition of a republic. So this, again, like government of the people, by the people, for the people, where does power lie? You know, in this period of the 18th century, the big argument, well, should it be Parliament? And people in Massachusetts said no. Now, today, big arguments about this, but just to answer your question, Congress appropriates money, and the Senate has to ratify treaties, okay? I'm not going to venture further into the discussion of this. I'd be happy to afterwards tell you what I think, other than just to say you should listen to this gentleman because he knows a lot about the subject. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
During this period, leading up to the actual war, there was a certain sympathetic point of view in some parts of Parliament, wasn't there, towards the cause there?
Yep.
Was that philosophic or was it economic?
That's a good question. Okay, there was a certain sympathy in parts of Parliament toward the American cause, which is true, and then the question was this philosophical or was it economical? Which is an interesting question. I suspect it was some of both. The English, remember, Parliament has, well, if you were British, you knew that Parliament was the great liberty-loving body in the world, which is why Governor Hutchinson didn't see a problem with Parliament governing, Massachusetts. And, you had the Magna Carta and so on. Now, there are political parties in Parliament. There is the party that becomes known as the Tories, the supporters of the court, the crown, and so on. And then there are the Whigs, the opposition party. In Dr. Johnson's dictionary, he defines the Tories as the upholders of our ancient Constitution and preservers of our traditions and of our God-given liberties. The Whigs, in Dr. Johnson's dictionary, are defined as a political faction. So the Whigs tended to support the Americans. And I don't think it was because they had strong trade relationships with them. Because here, people like Hutchinson and Oliver are called Tories because they tended to support the Tories in England. People like Josiah Quincy, John Adams tend to be called Whigs because they support the other faction. And in 1774, there was an election for Parliament, and there was some thinking that if the Whigs get in, all of these policies are going to be overturned, which they may well have been, but the Whigs don't get in. And one of the leading British Whigs, William Pitt, warns that this struggle you are creating in America is going to cause the whole rotten system of Parliament to collapse. Because people here are going to start asking about taxation and representation. Remember, there are places in England that had not, Parliament had been created in around the 1300s. And places that were fairly important in 1300 had a member of Parliament. And members of Parliament are not called representatives, they're members. Their job is to be a member of Parliament, not to represent a constituency. So there are places fairly important in 1300, they have a member. No one lives there now. But then there were other places that had not existed in 1300, like Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester. They don't have a member of Parliament because they hadn't existed then. And typically, legislative bodies are reluctant to restructure themselves to represent population. So, so if there is a place that doesn't have any people in it, the Prime Minister gets to appoint a member. And you may be a member of parliament from one place, those electors vote you out, well, we'll find another place for you if we want to keep you in parliament. And so you have parliament itself, by the 1830s, is transformed because of this whole idea of representation that comes from America. I know I'm not answering your question about whether there's an economic interest here. I suspect it's more philosophical, and typically the Whigs will oppose the centralization of power as long as the Tories love power, and once they get into power, they kind of like these things. So it's a very good question. Yes, sir.
To what extent were there people here in the colonies who didn't support independence, and to what extent was it really a civil war?
Well, it was a civil war to a large extent. One thing that makes Massachusetts a little bit different is we had a long period of this argument going on. And very quickly in 1774, when British troops arrived, you see things getting really ugly in many of the towns. For example, in Cambridge in September of 1774, there's an attack on some long-standing local people. In other towns of Massachusetts, a similar thing. And in the British occupy Boston, and Tories from the surrounding towns who want to remain loyal to the British Crown go into Boston. And when the British evacuate in March of 1776, about 1,100 of them leave with the British, and they never come back for the most part. And in fact, that's a relatively small number compared to other places. The British Crown, the British Parliament believe that most of the people in the rest of the colonies want to remain loyal. South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, New York. In fact, the British Army spends the rest of the war in New York. That's their base. And they occupy Philadelphia. They occupy every American city at some point during the war. And we don't know how many were loyal, how many were not. But in some places, it's much more divided than others. And it becomes a much more violent civil war in places like North Carolina and South Carolina, and in upstate New York, among the Native Americans versus locals. It's here because there's been this long-standing argument, and people have made up their minds, and also because the British leave here relatively early. So it's less of a civil war here than it will be in other places. There's only one town in Massachusetts. In April of 1776, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress sends out a questionnaire to the towns of Massachusetts asking, if we were to consider a resolution of independence, how should we vote? And the town meetings assemble to debate this. Imagine a time when the Massachusetts Assembly really wanted us to tell them what we thought, and then we're going to act upon it. But every town in Massachusetts says yes, except for one. Anyone know what that town is? Not Cambridge. No. Yes, yeah. Now, Barnstable and Cape Cod. This is kind of embarrassing for Barnstable because James Otis is from Barnstable. Mercy Otis Warren is from Barnstable. In fact, Barnstable's building statues of James Otis, Mercy Otis Warren, who did not spend their adulthood in Barnstable. And anyone from Barnstable should have said. Have you seen this? Excuse me?
I was going to ask a question.
Okay, well, in about an hour, I'll finish this question. The thing that happens in Barnstable is this. Yeah, the Otises are up in Barnstable, and the other big patriot family in Barnstable are the Crockers. And the Crockers have a tavern, it's a meeting place, and in fact, it's now a bed and breakfast, and they advertise on their website that this was the Faneuil Hall of Cape Cod, where the Crockers and the Otises got together to discuss independence, which is, yeah, you see, this is ridiculous, because you all know the Crockers and the Otises hated each other. And this is a small town, okay? And people know each other, and even if you tend to agree on some issue, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't think the other people who agree with you are reprehensible individuals, which apparently is the way the Crockers and the Otises regarded each other. And also, the Crocker Tavern, apparently one of the beams has saber marks And their website says, I don't want to denigrate them too much. I mean, they're trying to sell rooms, but it says saber marks caused by a redcoat regiment that marched through, apparently trying to break up a meeting between the Otises and the Crockers. But that's also not true. I can tell you how the saber marks got there. Seth Crocker he had a militia company. Joseph Otis had a militia company. In those days, you would recruit guys to be in your militia company, and they would elect you to be an officer. Okay, you get your militia group together, you train once a year, and then you fire off your guns and get drunk. Okay, that would be militia training, and for most of the colonial period. Okay, so one day on the militia training ground, someone in Seth Crocker's militia unit does not salute Joseph Otis the way Joseph Otis, Crocker and Otis are both lieutenants in the militia, so they're commanding their units. One unit doesn't salute the other, and so someone on Otis' side, hey, do you see the way those guys are disrespecting you? And they don't like it, and you can see what's going to happen. When a group of guys don't like what the other group is doing, they start fighting. A big fight breaks out. And one of the Crockers officers, being outnumbered by the Otises and also trying to get away from this big fight, go into the Crocker Tavern and are pursued by the Otises waving their swords, and their swords, fortunately the beams prevent blood being shed on the floor of the Crocker Tavern that day. Now, it's just shortly after this that the town meeting considers, should we declare a vote for independence? Now, there's another leading citizen of Barnstable, a man named Edward Bacon, and he's a loyalist. He says, what's going to happen when we no longer have the power and any power interposing here? We're going to have constant fighting between the Otises and the Crockers. Do you want that? People say, well, no, we don't. And so they vote against independence. They also elect Edward Bacon to be their representative to the Provisional Congress. And so he comes up to Boston to take his seat. And they say, you can't come in here. You don't support independence. He said, well, the voters in Barnstable sent me. He said, well, that doesn't matter. Tell them to send someone else. Okay, so that's all the people in Barnstable need to know. They don't want us to send him. Who do you think they're going to send? Him. Yeah, they're going to keep re-electing him. They can't tell us who to send. Who do they think they are? So Edward Bacon, every year, re-elected, he comes up to Boston. They say, you can't come in here. And by this time, of course, Barnstable likes independence, but the Assembly can't tell us who our representatives should be. That defeat the whole purpose of self-government. Finally, what happens with Edward Bacon, and I really think if anyone has any influence in Barnstable, you should work on getting a statue of him. Although there's another revolutionary figure Barnstable really should memorialize, and that's Elizabeth Freeman. And she's a woman, she keeps a little store on the town square. And she's a very sharp-tongued old widow. She has one son, and she speaks her mind. And in 1774, someone puts up a liberty pole in the town square. And she makes some comment about that ratty old pole. Someone should cut it down. And a couple of nights later, a gang of kids from Yarmouth or Sandwich or one of the nearby towns come in and they cut it down. Okay? Well, we can't find out those guys, but we know she was the one who was criticizing it. So the Sons of Liberty in Barnstable drag her out of bed one night. They tar and feather her and parade her through town. And yeah, it's a shocking thing. And her son's not there to defend her because he is in Cambridge with Washington's army. Yeah, you see, I thought the Cambridge was the punchline this time. But, okay, so he is serving with Washington's army. These guys who are in Barnstable, I guess trying to protect the Crocker Tavern from a fictional army of redcoats, drag her around town, tar and feather her. And this is, the town meeting assembles. James Otis Sr. presides over the town meeting, and he says, first, I think we should offer our apologies to the widow Freeman, and the rest of the town, people who weren't involved in this, say, no, you can't apologize for this. They refused to accept an apology for this because they recognized how wrong it was. So, Barnstable, I wonder why I'm never invited there to speak. So you have these disagreements happening in town. over which side we should be on, and sometimes they're really propelled by grievances that have nothing at all to do with the sacred cause of liberty.
Why don't we take two more questions?
Oh, two more, okay. Yes, sir.
You probably at least partially covered this, but was there any room in those days for executive action, you know, like Congress and the President and the two houses of Congress get
Well, that's a good question about executive action, and each state, each colony draws up its own form of government. There isn't an executive nationally until 1789, when the new Constitution goes into effect. And the states have different forms of government they are creating, and most of them take as their starting point an idea. Our problem really was the governor. You know, we had this fight between the assembly and the governor. The governor lost. So what we should do is have a system in which the assembly has the most power. So most states create systems in which the governor has very little power. The Massachusetts is an exception, and John Adams really recognizes the nature of this relationship. It's not that the assembly, because it represents the people, can do no wrong, and the governor, because he tends to become a dictator, can only do wrong. He recognizes that each one has their own interests. And in fact, he says the executive and legislative are natural rivals, and each has to be able to check the other one. And if you don't have this way of controlling their interests, you're going to have a despotism. So John Adams liked the idea of gridlock as a way of checking, you know, legislative bodies actually can do bad things, and an executive can do good things. They're working out what this relationship should be at the time. South Carolina creates a system in which, in a time of emergency, you can appoint a dictator to run things. But it's a subject really under argument at this time. It's one of the most fascinating arguments, actually, in the history of the world. I actually teach a course on this, so I really hesitate to get into this because, you know, we'll be here until, we'll spend the summer in this room. And until I close my eyes for too long and you all take off. But yeah, it really is the essential argument happening here. It's not just, let's get rid of British rule, but what kind of a rule will we institute in its place? And Linda said we could have one more question, but if you're going to beat up the person who raised it up.
What is this course that you have online? Is this MOOC?
Okay, I actually have two courses online. One is on the Constitution itself, the document, not the show. Okay, and it is, if you Google U.S. Constitution, a biography, you'll find it.
What consortium is it through?
It's Udemy, U-D-E-M-Y, which is, I guess, an upstart challenging Coursera and the other big ones. And the other is one we created at Suffolk on the history of Boston. It's, and that run, the Constitution one, anyone can start it at any point. The Suffolk one runs, it'll run again in May, and then probably late summer or fall. It runs about 3 times a year.
Is that the one on Canvas?
Yes, Canvas.
Very good one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Udemy one actually has about 7,000 people who have signed up for it. I have no idea how many have finished it. And the Suffolk one, it's at about 4,000. We also have a Facebook group that people have been joining in.
There's a lot of material on Canvas.
There is a lot of material. Yeah, yeah.